Hello and welcome to our talk about post-war Edinburgh. Using archive material which documents aspects of Edinburgh during the 1940s and 50s, today we are going to have a look at life in the city as it recovered in the aftermath of World War II. In these years, resources were limited, housing was lacking, in fact there was a crisis, and many new homes were needed for returning troops and the growing population. Life in recovery was still a challenge and rationing remained for some time, but there was growing hope as the capital began to boom. As Neil said, I'm Jackie Sangster and I work in the Learning and Inclusion team. Some of my colleagues are here today, and thank you to those of you who have joined us online. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. So as Neil alluded to, I work mainly with hundreds of thousands of digital archive records on a daily basis. And today we will be exploring some of those as I've just described. So, as it remains today, in 1945, Edinburgh's floral clock was a prominent feature on Princes Street Gardens. In fact, during the final years of the war, the clock served as a morale booster, used to convey messages of civic resilience with spirited messages like, now is the day, now's the hour, and fear not. These messages culminated in a celebratory Our Shining Hour in 1945 at the war's end. Safe to say, it was time for change. VE Day, Victory in Europe, had been celebrated on the 8th of May 1945, and gradually soldiers and those serving overseas started to return for long-awaited reunions. The lady in this photograph is Jean King of Haddington. She's photographed surrounded by men, most of whom are wearing DMOB suits. DMOB being short for demobilization from the forces. Ex-servicemen were given a DMOB suit to welcome them back to civilian life, otherwise known as Civvy Street. And just over 80 years ago, on the Mound, we see celebrations to mark VJ Day, Victory over Japan Day. And similar revelries were held throughout the country. 2 days of national holiday had been announced for the 15th and 16th of August by Prime Minister Clement Attlee, with celebrations pouring out into the streets. To the delight of the watching crowd, here we can see Margaret Copeland, LACW, leading aircraft woman, dancing with a sailor. World War II ended on the 2nd of September 1945 with the surrender of the Japanese after the dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The end of the war brought joy and relief to thousands. On the home front, it was time to stand down and attempt to resume something resembling normal life after the ravages of war. Let me introduce the civilian fire guards pictured on top of the government offices in Edinburgh. Somewhat reminiscent of Dad's army, I always think. However, the desire for a return to normality would take time. As mentioned, rationing was still necessary. Here is a 1946 recipe leaflet giving advice on how to make the fat ration go further. It was one of a series issued by the Ministry of Food. It offers ideas like mixing butter or margarine with mashed potato or flour to make it go further, and saving the fat from meat and rendering it down to mix with other ingredients to make sandwich spread. Saving and cleaning used fat to be used again was another suggestion. Tips on how to save fat when frying and roasting potatoes are also included. Similar advice was issued in January 1947, and this recipe advised on how to make puddings without eggs. For example, special plum pudding, which uses a mixture of raw potato and carrot as a binding agent instead of egg. Mocha pudding, marshmallow cream, and semolina pudding are also included as egg-free desserts. If on a menu today, likely to be vegan. It was not just the rationing of food which continued. Other commodities such as clothing and petrol were limited in various forms until 1954. With the war ending came a wave of new events and ideas for the city's future. In comparison to other major cities, the built environment and fabric of Edinburgh was relatively unscathed by World War II. Here we can see the buildings of the south side bending around Salisbury Crags. Those of you in the room might have a keen eye and actually be able to pinpoint John Sinclair House, where we are sat today. This vertical aerial image shows Holyrood Park on the 15th of August 1947, taken by RAF 58 Squadron. Captured on the same sortie, at the top of this shows the grid layout of Edinburgh's new town, then the castle and the grass market and the meadows beyond. 2 years later, in 1949, something radical was proposed, namely the Abercrombie Plan. I should just go off at a moment. Afterwards, you'll have an opportunity to actually see a copy of the Abercrombie Plan in the material that's been laid out today in John Sinclair House. The Abercrombie Plan proposed the creation of a major inner ring road which would encircle the old town and blast through the south side of Edinburgh. If it had gone ahead, the grass market was at risk of being demolished and replaced. Zooming in on the 1949 map, A Civic Survey and Plan for Edinburgh by Abercrombie and Plumstead, we can see in the quay in yellow ochre and post-1939 development is marked in a grey and white circle symbol, and the interwar development is marked in the yellow ochre. We will see these surface several times as we travel around the city during the talk. If the grass market had been cleared and redeveloped in line with the Abercrombie Plan, it might have looked something like this artist's impression of the suggested buildings for the new district. It was to have been the home of an Edinburgh Festival Centre, as illustrated in The Scotsman in September 1949. However, the scheme was rejected. After that near miss, let's return to 1947, the year of the big snow, as captured here in Harrison Park. These children embraced this particularly severe winter in Edinburgh, and left to right they are Louise Wilson, Wallace Woodward, and Audrey and Joyce Arigi. In the summer of the same year, an all-new exhibition was under construction, namely Enterprise Scotland. It opened on the 25th of August at the Royal Scottish Museum, or the National Museum of Scotland as we know it today, on Chambers Street, and ran until the 30th of September. You may recognise the glazed roof over the main hall. The purpose of this large-scale show was to attract buyers from both home and overseas markets through the display of well-designed Scottish products. More than 30 Scottish industries were represented, including shipbuilding, printing and packaging, tartans, woolens and linoleum. The ceiling shows a map of Scotland which hung over the sports section, with main towns picked out in lights. Organised by the Scottish Committee of the Council of Industrial Design, it was to complement the Britain Can Make It exhibition, which had been held at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London the previous year. Here we can see an assortment of packaging and Scots products displayed at the exhibition. Look carefully and you'll spot McConaughey's Scotch broth, McConaughey's Scotch herrings, McConaughey's kippers. There's also Three Nuns tobacco, Dobby's Foursquare Curlies tobacco, and Foursquare Empire Cut for the smokers. And then we have Aberdeen macaroni made from semolina, the De La Rue pen, Frost's table salt, a caramel munch bar, and finally a dusting of DDT powder for the garden pests and DDT moth powder for the home. You'll have perhaps noticed the beloved local brand W&M Duncan, who made Duncan's Choco-Milk chocolate bars at the time, and they were manufactured at 27 Beaverhall Road in Edinburgh. There was TCP too, with its unmistakable smell. This antiseptic with additional therapeutic properties for internal and external use was manufactured by William Thine Limited at their Lochend Works. And here is their Lochend Works, where it was made on Marionville Road, pictured in 1932. I should really have some TCP to hand round to enhance that experience right now. Likewise, there were tins of paint, which were manufactured by William Sim and Sons in Leith. Haberdashery and Scottish threads famously made in Paisley at both J&P Coates Mills at Fergusley and Clark's Anchor Threadworks at Seed Hill. They were proudly shown as well. Coates thread is still a market leader, however made elsewhere now, as with the Anchor brand. More textiles in the form of a lady's woolen jumper sporting a lion rampant or a griffin was manufactured in the Borders by the Ballantine sportswear brand. Tourism was not overlooked and featured in a display called Country Section. Hotels, history and travel exhibits are pictured here with a few familiar faces, including Burns and Scott. This, as we know, is an industry which continues to grow in Scotland, boosting our economy and global profile. Finally, to conclude our visit to Enterprise Scotland exhibition and its many displays, here we have what was billed as the modern kitchen, an aspiration for many living in less than adequate conditions and accommodations across the city. So, how was Edinburgh Corporation starting to address the dire need for homes and new housing in the city? The state-of-the-art modern kitchen that we just saw on exhibition would not have looked out of place here. These are the plans for council houses built for rent in Edinburgh, specifically 3-storey tenement blocks comprising of 12 3-bedroom dwellings. They were adapted from the Orlet system designed by Czech architect Ervin Katona, and in their contemporary context, they were built to generous standards and came with a well-equipped bathroom and kitchen. This is a drawing of the ground and upper floor plans. This drawing is of the front and the rear, and it shows the great simplicity of the elevations and almost identical front and rear faces of the building. They had metal windows and a close door, front and back. You may have noticed this example in the Bingham area of Edinburgh had a flat roof. Remember the Abercrombie plan? And in the Quay, the Bingham area between Joppa and Jock's Lodge was earmarked for future development. The Orlets of Duddingston Row were the beginnings of this wave of post-war housing. And here is number 75 to 77 Duddingston Row as it looked in 1986. The prefabricated tenement designed to meet wartime shortages of houses, materials and skilled labour. The system of factory-built prefabricated concrete panels was intended to reduce construction time and use a minimum of timber. The concrete system was produced by the Scottish Orlet Company. It had a head office and one of its factories on the Sighthill Industrial Estate. And there was another factory in Dundee. Orlets were widely used throughout Scotland, and in some cases beyond, by local authorities between the end of World War II and into the 1950s. During the war, remnants of the Polish army came to Scotland, and they worked in agriculture and helped to defend Scotland's east coast. Then, at the end of the war, with demobilisation, many of the troops stayed and went on to marry locals. People such as this family, pictured on Jameson Place in Leith, 1947, would no doubt have welcomed the opportunity to live in such luxury as a permanent orlet, or perhaps a temporary prefab house. From Bingham, our next housing hotspot is at Maidencraig Crescent at Blackhall. And with the red arrow, I have tried to pinpoint it on a section of the Abercrombie survey map. So if you can get your bearings, we're somewhere near Sainsbury's. Number 32, Maidencraig Crescent, was another type of prefab home, namely the Arrow House. Its walls were made of precast concrete panels, and this one was built between 1944 and 46 by Arrow Units of Edinburgh. Stepping inside, we can see, although it's not quite as well kitted out as the modern kitchen from the Enterprise Scotland exhibition, the kitchen of number 32, Maidencraig Crescent, was, I think we could describe it as adequate and probably quite good for its time. It had a deep porcelain sink, fold-down shelves designed to hold a mangle. Clothes would be washed and mangled in the deep sink. From Blackhall, we're off to West Mains using our Abercrombie map. Witness housing construction on West Mains Road, apparently a shutter system framework. Beyond the crane, that appears to be Arthur's Seat, as photographed on the 22nd of November, 1947. My curiosity was piqued, so compliments of Google Street View, here are the buildings of West Mains today. This housing endured longer than expected and looks well maintained. Taking a breather from building and returning to the heart of the city, Edinburgh's renowned cultural extravaganza was born in 1947. I refer, of course, to the Edinburgh International Festival. Similarly, in August 1947, Scottish filmmaker John Grierson opened the newly established Edinburgh International Film Festival, the EIFF. And here is some early festival ephemera. A souvenir programme, an all-important wine list from the 9th Edinburgh International Festival of Music and Drama, 1955, and also a programme from 56. After the war, the opportunity to embrace such events must have felt wonderful. Today, our Edinburgh Arts Festivals are amongst the most important in the world and are an integral part of the Scottish tourist industry, encouraging and promoting arts and culture. Yet, alongside these social advances and cultural developments, putting food on the table was not simple. Shortages were still common, and this ration book was issued by the Ministry of Food and belonged to Miss Dorothy Slee of 9 Cochrane Terrace in 1953. It contains coupons for those foods that were still rationed, including tea, cheese, bacon, and sugar. Other items such as meat, butter, and cooking fats continued to be rationed into 1954. Although World War II had ended, something sinister was looming over the nation with the advent of the Cold War. Although the city had just emerged from one war, another was afoot. The skies above Turnhouse Airfield remained busy with RAF 603 City of Edinburgh Auxiliary Squadron. Here are their Vampire jets pictured in the skies over the city in November 1947. The political differences of communism and capitalism between the USSR and the Western Allies led to 45 years of tension, an arms race, and the constant threat of nuclear war. Would the Anderson bomb shelters of World War II have to be occupied again? This 1950s photograph shows the prefabs of West Pilton in the north of the city, near where West Granton is today. You might have noticed already there's also a prefab behind the Anderson shelter. During World War II, the Royal Observer Corps worked with the RAF, reporting the direction, height, and strength of enemy aircraft so they could be intercepted. Immediately after the war, the ROC had been disbanded. However, it reformed in 1947 at the start of the Cold War. As we can see here, observer training was underway again in Edinburgh in 1952. Threat became increasingly recognised, and these civilian volunteer observers were once again practising their skills at Carlton Terrace in May 1952. This is a post-instrument plotter consisting of a sighting system over a map grid. And all this was happening inside number 14 Carlton Terrace, around the back of Calton Hill. From 1957 onwards, the ROC's main task was to monitor fallout in the event of nuclear attack. This is inside the ops room, with observers plotting positions on charts during an exercise. To enable the ROC to operate in a nuclear environment, a network of 1,563 underground monitoring posts were built in the 50s and 60s throughout the UK. This observer is holding a fixed survey-meter dome affixed to the outside of the post. Its function was to monitor gamma radiation and detect. It's entirely possible the ROC observers could have spotted this in the skies above Edinburgh. This Valletta aircraft was used by the Ferranti flying unit for instrument testing from 53 to 58 at Turnhouse, seen here on the apron in 1953. Ferranti, of course, were big employers locally, having their factory at Crewe Toll since 1943. Back down to earth with a bump, as we visit the emergency housing camps of post-war Edinburgh. Entering the 50s, there was still a desperate need on the ground for housing. This photograph looks across Seaton Sands camp, originally a holiday camp, and accommodation ranges from repurposed railway wagons to prefabricated chalets. At this stage, it was also being used as a temporary camp for the homeless after World War II and into the 1950s. There were several other repurposed camps on the edge of Edinburgh. Firstly, Lochinvar, and yes, this is the site near Granton in 1949 on the Abercrombie map. During World War II, this was a naval training establishment, but in 1946 it was passed to Edinburgh Corporation and used to house homeless families that did not qualify for any other housing. Note the disaffected graffiti, "A Hero's Home." An article in the Evening Dispatch in 1951 described some of the problems in the various camps. In it, Lochinvar camp was described as the most habitable, although in this image taken on the 15th of November 1947, it looks rather bleak. As you could hopefully make out, it consisted of curved corrugated iron Nissen huts, as well as new wooden huts with communal kitchens and wash houses. The camp was sited on the northern part of the playing fields in Wardie Primary School, just off Granton Road. not far from Granton Harbour. And zooming in, you can just about see the dwellings as they stood in 1948. Pictured in 1953, many of these young children may have been born and raised at the Lochinvar camp, not knowing any other home. However, by the spring of 1957, when this aerial photo was taken of the Trinity area, we can clearly see the footprint of the extensive camp which had been razed to the ground. Lochinvar was not alone. Conditions were similar at the Sighthill camp. And looking at the Abercrombie map, you may recognise the location. Here are the children from the Wester Hales nursery at Sighthill camp, along with a local dog in 1950. And detail of the poor housing at Sighthill camp. Note the men working on the roofs, a woman wearing a pinny and guiding a pram at the front of the pathway. The exterior of the houses were covered in corrugated iron. Next, we're going to visit the Duddingston camp within an area bounded by Duddingston Road West and Duddingston Golf Course. And pictured from above in 1947, we can clearly see the golf course. More detail of the camp is apparent in this area taken in 1947. It doesn't show the full extent of the camp because most of it is amongst the trees. A sad sight. In 1951, this ex-regular soldier with his wife and 6 children were made homeless after being evicted from his hut, where they had been squatting. The eviction was at the instigation of the War Office, who had requisitioned the ground during the war. As at the other camps around the city, the temporary housing consisted of basic tin shelters called Nissen huts. A Nissen hut is also a prefabricated building, but semicircular with a steel frame covered in corrugated iron. They were invented by Major Peter Nissen during World War I for temporary military use. They provided very cramped living conditions. Many residents were still living in this accommodation well into the 1950s. And the following 7 images showing Duddingston Camp to the east of Edinburgh during that time. The residents were obviously not happy with the situation, daubing the huts with graffiti saying, "Edinburgh's black spot." Another slogan painted on the side of a Nissen hut draws attention to Edinburgh's housing problem. And these images appeared in the Picture Post magazine in a feature about Edinburgh called The Best and Worst of British Cities from 1954. We can step inside with this young mother. Meet Mrs. Blackie with her 4 children inside their 24-foot by 20-foot tin hut, where they lived with Mr. Blackie. You can see she's making the best of a bad situation. The adaptation of these semicircular huts to housing was not popular, despite their low cost. Typical rectangular furniture does not fit well into a curved wall, so the actual usable space was severely limited. These ex-military huts were not intended as family homes. In Scotland, they were frequently cold, drafty, and damp, with condensation. Far from ideal. On the 31st of October 1956, the Evening Dispatch reported the city's camps at Duddingston, Craigentinny and Sighthill had closed and the final residents of Lochinvar camp had moved out. The residents of the housing camps were not the only people on the move, however. Meet Mrs. Bridget McKeever and her sons at their tenement flat at 8 Greenside Row at the top of Leith Walk. They are being evacuated as the block is to be demolished. Similarly, The Boyle family were given notice to quit their home in Shrub Place, near Leith Walk, within just 7 days. Tenements at numbers 4 and 5 were to be evacuated due to large cracks which had formed at the rear of the building, making it unsafe. Meanwhile, at Milnes Court off Lawnmarket, at the top of the Royal Mile, the tenants of number 6, Mrs. G. Stratton and Mrs. Panton, are packing before moving into their new housing. I wonder where they made their home. Some may have moved from the city centre to newly constructed prefabricated houses at Musselburgh. So far, we have seen examples of the Scottish Orlet, Arrow units, and this prefab by Cruden Homes. However, we must not overlook the next solution to post-war housing. Also in Musselburgh, on a new council housing estate, we see a row of prefabricated cottages with neatly fenced and hedged gardens. Unlike the previous prefabs we have seen, this is a different beast in that it is intended to be a temporary dwelling. Likewise, we see them in Coniston, and they are called Arrow houses, with new multi-storey flats beyond. In this 1947 film clip, which I'll play in a second, we see sections of prefabricated Arrow houses being made and loaded onto lorries, ready to be taken to brand new housing estates for swift assembly. The name is an acronym, AIROH, Air Industry Research Organisation for Housing. After the war, there was a surplus of leftover metal from the factories producing airplanes. Therefore, the aircraft industry shifted its efforts, skills and facilities to make these aluminium homes. Now, those of you online, it is a silent film, but hopefully it will play and you'll be able to see what's happening. You'll see here that one of the workers is putting in some of the concrete. Now, quite often that concrete also included asbestos, and at the time the risk was not appreciated that that was very dangerous material to have in the fabric of your building. And off we go, a section of a house. And many. This photograph was likely taken at our next housing development. Looking at the Abercrombie map again, we've returned to a familiar location just opposite the Sighthill camp, was a shiny new estate called the Calders, or Sighthill Prefab Estate, where you can clearly see the street layout. Within the curve of the Union Canal, there were streets named Calder Drive, Calder Terrace, Calder Crescent, Calder Lone, Calder Cottages, Calder Circle, and so on. The Calders consisted mostly of Arrow houses and another type of prefab called the Archon, temporary bungalow. Unlike the Orlet houses, these were not intended to be permanent. This Archon prefab got its name from the original firm Architectural Consultants, Archon. As you can see, it's noticeably different with corrugated cladding, and it was the second most produced temporary prefab after the Arrow. Unfortunately, this one suffered gale damage due on its roof on Calder Crescent in 1956. By 1962, Sighthill prefabs were reaching the end of their temporary lives and being demolished. Next, we're going to visit Dunby Dykes, bounded by Holyrood Road, the Pleasance, St Leonard's and Holyrood Park. And for those of you in the room, you'll know that we're just up the road. We're going to see what happened to the community here between the end of the war and 1960. Returning to the Abercrombie map, this area is close to the old town with limited recent or any early 20th century housing. You'll see hardly any ochre on the map. Dunby Dykes took its name from the work of Thomas Braidwood, a pioneer in education for the deaf, who opened his first academy on Dunby Dykes Road, 1760. These Arthur Street tenements were due for demolition when photographed here in February 1952. Mrs. White was pictured in a feature in the Scotsman newspaper titled Slums in the Dunby Dykes on the 2nd of December 1955. By the middle of the 20th century, Dunby Dykes was densely populated and many of the properties were in decline. These women on their front step are also in a newspaper piece in 1955. The majority of these tenement buildings were completely demolished. Tenants like these were moved out to new schemes, perhaps not best pleased or at the end of their tether. This photograph shows the interior decay of the tenement at number 17 Arthur Street, and resident Mrs. Bremner points to the gaping holes in the ceiling at the top of her stair. Similarly, the walls are crumbling around James and David Donaldson in the living room of their home on Arthur Street. Demolition and slum clearances were underway on Beaumont Place in January 1956. In 1958, this family were to be evacuated from their condemned tenement on Heriot Mount. Some locals were rehoused in the high-rise flats built on the site of the old streets. The built environment was permanently changed and a community dispersed. Beaumont Place, Arthur Street completely disappeared with the remodelling of the area. This shows Arthur Street tenements being demolished in 1969. Next, I have some oral history reminiscences to share with you. One specifies Arthur Street, and the memories I'm about to play come from Douglas Watson, Evelyn Weir, Helen Greenlaw, Jeanette Simpson, Jean Bell, and Marjorie Coburn. So the people I've just named had been brought up and lived in Edinburgh throughout the post-war years. Using photographs from the Scotsman as a stimulus, they shared their stories with a former colleague of mine, Helen Foster, in 2008. The resulting montage of voices represent the social history of Edinburgh homes, family life, slum clearances, and solutions to post-war housing problems. So here we are.
That, to me, wasn't a slum. I don't know why people regarded this sort of thing as Edinburgh slums, because they were not. People did what they could afford, you know.
And took my French pen pal up the Pleasance. She says, "It is the houses of the poor, Jean." I said, well, a lot of them were quite well to do.
I take it there wasn't an awful lot of repairs done, and the houses were just neglected. I mean, some of the houses, oh my goodness me.
And yet a lot of them were really
lovely
nice
people that were in it.
Lovely
people in it.
What they had, it was well kept.
You could see the places that were being demolished that could have been saved and that, really, you know.
My father was an invalid. He took ill a month before I was born, and it was a spiral staircase in the old house, and my father had to climb up on his hands and knees. There was no railing or anything for him to hold on to. The house subsequently was actually condemned long before the war, but it was years and years before they took it down.
They demolished that many years ago. Now Bristol Street, the street isn't there anymore. There used to be houses and shops and everything. St Leonard's was all different right along St Leonard's. I mean, there used to be massive row of high tenements right along. And I can't even take my grandchildren to say, oh, this is where I was born. Even Simpsons, where I was born, is no longer there, you know.
I remember going to school in a house at the top of Carnegie Street. Part of it fell. You could see the doors and fireplaces, what have you. I mean, I don't know how Arthur Street stayed up so long, really.
Mum was about one of the last to leave the Dummadykes. A lot of them got moved.
We landed up in the prefab. The prefab was quite comfortable. In fact, people who stayed in the prefabs later on didn't want to leave them, you know, because it was like a wee bungalow. The kitchen was actually quite spacious. They were all situated in their wee bit garden. We had quite a bit.
When the houses were built, there were strict regulations for people to adhere to. If the Queen was in residence, they weren't even allowed to hang washing up, just in case it offended her, you know. You can't replace these times at all.
I hope you enjoyed listening to those oral history reminiscences. This was the model of proposed redevelopment for the Dummadykes on the 26th of October 1960. Redevelopment for Lochview Court in Dummadykes was commissioned in 1958 and completed in 1963. This photograph shows a local councillor shaking hands with Mrs. Alice Mann, one of the first tenants of the new properties at Lochview Court, and caretaker Mr. Thompson is also pictured. I think he might have been in that fire department earlier. Change was constant in post-war Edinburgh, but next, let's take a breather. The coronation of Queen Elizabeth II took place on the 2nd of June 1953. It was celebrated nationwide with a public holiday and community events. Princes Street was decked out, ready to celebrate. The new Queen toured Scotland, visiting Edinburgh for the key ceremony at the castle, Murrayfield Stadium, and St Giles Cathedral, with the Knights of the Thistle. Then onwards to Glasgow, Lanarkshire, and Balmoral, amongst other destinations in her coronation year. This state visit by the Queen and her husband, the Duke of Edinburgh, took place on the 23rd to the 29th of June 1953. The city turned out for the occasion and large programme of proceedings ensued, such as a procession up the Mound, a Highland Ball at the Assembly Rooms, and the dancing continued at a youth rally at Murrayfield with these Highland dancers. There were other reasons to be hopeful and happier in 1950s Edinburgh. The end of rationing in 1948, but as I mentioned, continued for many products, including sweets. On the 24th of April 1949, sweet rationing initially ceased. However, this was hastily reversed in 1949 due to panic buying. Then finally, in February 53, sweet rationing finally was lifted and all rationing ended, with the restriction on meat and bacon being lifted at midnight on the 4th of July 1954. Which meant the workers at W.M. Duncan Limited chocolate factory were going to be busy. Duncan's confections in post-war Edinburgh included such delights as funny faces, Duncan's toffee bars, ginger bars, original hazelnut bars, and of course, walnut whips. And I actually noticed another one just the other day. There's something called a bobbing duck just to the right of the image. All of the above would have been well received by these two children dressed up as cowboys and playing with their toy guns. I imagine they would have been beside themselves when Roy Rogers and his trusty horse Trigger arrived at Cally Station in February 1950. Now, of course, the Caledonian Hotel. In the 50s, cowboys and their pioneering adventures and encounters captured the imaginations with depictions on stage, in circus acts, and probably most notably on film and TV. The Western was king. The Lone Ranger even rode into town, and actor Clayton Moore visited the wards of the Princess Margaret Rose Hospital in 1954. As well as trips to see the latest Westerns at the cinema, children were playing in the streets of Edinburgh. The Edinburgh Corporation had designated many inner city streets as children's play areas, requesting vehicle drivers to avoid them from the end of school until sunset. And this photo in The Scotsman shows boys having a cuddy fight on piggyback in Tron Square. Cuddy being Scots for donkey or horse, so in other words, boisterous horseplay. Taken in April 1950. In my next slide, we have a film from 1951 called The Singing Street that some of you may be familiar with. It documents what went on in the play streets. It's an amateur film made by the teachers of Norton Park School and not meant for education or entertainment. It was shot in 6 days over Easter, and the cast were mostly girls, numbering 60. So again, we've got a film clip. This one has sound, and apologies to those of you online if you cannot hear it. It will be picked up on the recording, which will end up on YouTube.
Down in the valley where the green grass grows, where Mary Glee, she grows like a rose, she grows, she grows, she grows so sweet that she calls for a lover at the end of the street. Sweetheart, sweetheart, will you marry me? Yes, love, at 3:30. Ice cakes, spice cakes, all for tea, and we'll have a wedding at 3:30. Pom, pom, here comes a taxicab, pom, pom, here comes a taxicab, pom, pom, here comes a taxicab, ready for the wedding at 3:30.
The film is a fantastic glimpse of Edinburgh's social history. And here we have some keen mechanics at work on their homemade Guider go-karts in 1953, sometimes known as bogies or trolleys, but all such contraptions were created with old pram wheels, planks, string, whatever was available. One of these in the photo has stenciling saying Delhi, so presumably wood taken from an imported tea chest. Others were playing marbles in Lapiside Place in Leith. And this shows the official National Playing Fields Association signage with designated play times and reads Children's Playground, no vehicles please, 4 p.m. till sunset. Thanks to a colleague at the National Library of Scotland, Emma Boyd, she attended this talk the last time I gave it, and she got in touch with me because I didn't know the location of this street previously, but she very helpfully pinpointed it for me. It's Johnson Street in Leith, 1952. The street no longer exists, but would have been just off Commercial Street next to Dock Street. Edinburgh's population wasn't just staying active through play, they were embracing a wide variety of sports too. Here we see the Lord Provost of Edinburgh lighting the Fiery Cross in 1947. This was a unique event involving a relay race from Edinburgh to London. And you might be surprised to see sky flying or ski jumping in the Bred Hills. Meet Arnie Hoel, a Norwegian champion. In April 1951, ski jumpers from Norway constructed a temporary ski slope or a wooden structure at the Bred Hills in Edinburgh. 60 tons of snow were brought over from Norway. There were problems with customs, and the British agency wanted to charge 406 Norwegian krones for each ton of snow. Fortunately, this was settled before the snow melted. Then a Scottish ski jumping competition with participating athletes from Norway was held, and 2 days of competition were attended by over 10,000 spectators. What a show. Next up was our beloved winter sport of curling. And this indoor match was held at an Edinburgh rink on the 30th of January 1954. At the time, Edinburgh had 2 main ice rinks, the Murrayfield rink and the Haymarket rink, where I believe this is. Also, Joe has very kindly got out some original archive material of Murrayfield. And Reverend Dr. Bogle appeared in the picture post in the same feature, The Best and Worst of British Cities. Again, at the Haymarket rink, but this time some Caledonian curlers have come to play. They are the Richardson family, namely Cyril, Arnold, Janet and Wes from Saskatchewan. In July 1958, local hero Jackie Brown was being welcomed back to his home on Line Street, Abbey Hill, with a gold medal he had won in the flyweight boxing contest at the Empire Games, or Commonwealth Games as they're known now, held in Cardiff. Not far afield, there was a speedway, and the spectators are having fun at Meadowbank in 1959. Riders lined up on the 28th of June, revved and ready to let loose. Stiff competition continued at the Speedway as Jimmy Tannock tries to overtake Jack Winstanley on the 12th of July, 1959. We're nearing the conclusion of our archive tour of life in post-war Edinburgh. The outlook for the future was improving, and these visitors from St Columba's High School in Cowdenbeath were taking in a view over the Royal Mile in 1955 from the top of the Camera Obscura. Tim Wright and his big band tunes led us into the new decade in December 1950. Hogmanay crowds gathered as dictated by tradition at the Tron to usher in 1951. And fun was had in the street by revellers. And it seemed to continue at the Tron Kirk in 1956. By 1958, at the Palais de Dance, we can see the come dancing old-time dancers from Fife and the Reg Harkins formation team too. Time is ticking and the 1950s are drawing to a close. The 1960s beckon, and it's service with a smile for this customer at H&J Hildersley, a grocer and wine merchants at Lindsay Road, Leith, in advance of Hogmanay, pictured on the 29th of December. We have reached 1960 and the end of our talk. At last, it's time for a nice cup of tea with Alex Johnson and in his Salisbury Street home in the Dummy Dykes. I hope you've enjoyed exploring the archive photographs documenting life following World War II until 1960. This parting shot shows keen photographers hoping to get a snap of the Duke of Edinburgh visiting Ethicon at the Sighthill Industrial Estate in 1960, just a stone's throw from the Calder's prefab estate. Thank you very much for listening.